I guess to me, well, I didn't want to do this in the time of COVID, that's for sure. Oh, that person died, I'll just put a line through her. I mean, it seems a little too soon. Not ready to do that quite yet. I don't know, marriages, divorces, same-sex relationships, people who don't want to be identified as I'm a girl or I'm a boy, things get messy really fast. And I think in anthropology, there is a tendency to sort of, and in many societies, there's a tendency to sort of gloss that stuff over. And so the kinship charts would sometimes come out looking very regular and very nice, in part because people want to present that as the official story, the official side of themselves. So, I think it's important to recognize the messiness of social life, and that sometimes these things are not as clear-cut as we once believed they were. But who knows? Maybe it's fine. All right, so we'll talk here about the kinship and descent part a little bit. So how we, right off of this kinship chart, why in our society would I want you to put, and she wants you to put, your kinship chart, why does it get wide? Why do they go wide and not deep? Huh?
Because we have siblings.
Because you have siblings. Yes, the siblings spread out, but there's something else that happens as you go back in generations. Let's put it this way. How many parents do you have? Grandparents. Great-grandparents. How many of you can name one of your great-grandparents? One of your 16 you should have. So our charts get wide, but they don't go very deep. It's very odd for anybody to be able to reel off 5 generations back. We can usually go grandparents, when you're young, maybe great-grandparents. I don't know, maybe somebody knows some great-great-grandparents, but rare. It's kind of rare to know, but there'd be 16 of them potentially, right? So the reason our charts are wide is actually because of the way we reckon our kin. It's a technical term that in Lavenda and Schultz they call bilateral kindred. It means that in our society, we believe that we are equally related to the people on our mother's side and the people on our father's side, that they are both our kin. Now, that is one way, it's a common way to reckon kinship, but there are also other ways in which kinship is reckoned. One of them is called, and it's a fairly widespread system as well, I think maybe perhaps the majority of systems, is called a patrilineal system. And in patrilineal societies, things like descent, inheritance, property start to flow down the father's side or the male side of the line. And in some cases, so does relatedness, so that you will consider yourself to be perhaps not unrelated to the people on your mother's side, but more related to the people on your father's side, because those people are sort of more important to you as a person who lives in this kind of society. There is something about our kinship system which for most people is a little bit patrilineal. What's that? For most people. Changing a tiny bit, but usually not that much. Do we have any patrilineal aspects of our kinship system? Ferguson's. We usually tend to take our father's name. I'm just making a guess. You guys aren't related, are you? No, all right. Yes, we have twins here, but we usually have, yes, most of the time. And, like I said, things are changing and people have complicated histories, but this is what we might call a patrilineal aspect of our kinship system, which is that inheritance of names, or the naming system, goes through the father's line. Less prominent, or not less prominent. There are fewer matrilineal societies that have been found, but there's quite a few, lots of them, especially I think in people that were indigenous to the Americas. Lots of matrilineal systems among Native American peoples. Matrilineages, the inheritance and the stuff flows through the mother's side. And in this case, it's not, as Lavenda and Schultz say, it doesn't make it a matriarchy. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a female-dominated society, but certain things tend to be, things get different in matrilineal societies, in the sense that your most important relatives are not necessarily going to be your father, but if you're a son, your mother's brother, because those are the people who will be kind of with you, and where you're getting your inheritance through is through the mother's side of the equation. And so there's a lot of debate about, well, do women have more power in matrilineal societies? And it's not necessarily clear cut. There are instances where it seems like they do, but there are instances where they have certain forms and not other forms of power. But it's a very different way, or it's a different way of reckoning kinship that leads to some interesting issues in how people think of themselves as related to each other. Now, as Lavenda and Schultz say, and some of you picked up on in the comments, there's a logic to this lineage system. And a lot of anthropologists tried to document this system as a way of, in the claims that these were the things that organized society, whether you lived in a patrilineal or a matrilineal society, as our old anthropologist friend Evans-Pritchard comes back here with his famous study of the Nuer. We talked about this in terms of political organization. The idea is that without a centralized state or a centralized government, they were able to organize themselves basically along these ideas of the patrilineage and the clan that was around it. But as Lavenda and Schultz say, it's very important that they say lineages might look solid and unchanging. They're often more flexible than they appear, which is to say that, like we said with the kinship chart, a lot of times people will try to present this as, oh, this is why we do things, and that's the official version, but there's often a lot more flexibility in practice or in everyday life. And although anthropologists once believed that the kinship stuff was kind of the key to understanding a society, later on, people have figured out that that's often important, but not perhaps as, it was an easy thing to diagram, but it doesn't necessarily explain why people do the things they do. In terms of kinship systems, I want to introduce the idea of again, how people are related to each other. This is going to come up when we talk in the next section about marriage ideas as well, which is something that we probably in our own society haven't thought much about, the idea of parallel cousins and cross cousins. Now, this is perhaps a little more anthropologically complex than I want it to be, but basically in our society, like the word aunt, the word cousin covers all kinds of people. It doesn't matter if it's on father's or mother's side, and in some cases they goes way out into people that aren't even technically related to us. They'll still be our cousins. But the point in a patrilineal or a matrilineal society, you're going to feel perhaps more related to the people on one side than the people on another side. So if I am, let's say I'm that ego there, right in the white triangle. If I am that person in a patrilineal society, my cousins, especially my matrilateral cross cousins, are going to feel rather distant from me. They're going to probably live in a whole other place. I'm not going to see them that much. And so in some societies, certain forms of cross cousins, even what we might consider first cross cousins, are actually seen as okay marriage partners, maybe even favored marriage partners, because you know about them, but they're not really related to you. Now, I know that some of you might have a sort of icky first cousin reaction to that, but I just want to assure you the genetics on this gets reshuffled all over time. It's not going to produce all those things that we believe when cousins marry each other. But I guess what the point here is that we make our kinship relations. And so even people who we might consider biologically related can in some instances be said to not be biologically related. And other people that are not biologically related, at least from our point of view, can come into our kinship system as being like biologically related. And so this leads us to think about ways in which people make kinship, or they create different forms of relatedness than what we might be used to. So Lavenda and Schultz talk about the idea of adoption, especially turning to some ethnographic work that was done in highland Ecuador. And basically, one of the interesting things about this place is that kinship is not just something that happens when you're born. It's something that happens over time, and it's crucially related to how people feed each other. And so if someone is feeding you, that person can become your mother or father. And they don't mean it as, they mean it in a very literal sense. It's the person who feeds you is becoming your mother or father. So it's not something that it's not a one-off thing. It's something that you develop over time, and those relationships can shift around so that whoever it is that is feeding you is going to be your most important part of your life. Another couple things that one of the other things that Lavenda and Schultz mentioned that is happening more in recent years is that, you know, some of our ideas about who's related to whom have been challenged by these new reproductive technologies. So things like being able to take sperm from a donor, implant it into an egg from another donor, and put that fertilized egg into another woman to carry the child, brings up some complicated issues about who and how we make kinship. And so this is kind of, you know, it plays with, or it challenges some of our notions about who belongs to whom and how we should envision this. And of course, it ends up being played out in the courts as well. They also bring up the relationship of compadrazgo, or co-parenthood, that happens, godparenthood, in Latin America and in other places where these sort of perhaps they're more associated with Catholicism, but how this is another way in which kinship is made or introduced, these bonds among and between different people. Another fairly interesting thing that we may not have thought about is kinship that, or ideas of kinship that people place onto organ transplants. And this is something that is somewhat is highly charged in the medical field, because a lot of people want to separate those parts and not to think about the donors. But there are lots of times when donors and patients who've received this want to establish those kinds of kinship type relationships. So these are different ways in which people have established these relationships of relatedness, even though we might call the biology of it into question. And then I guess I now want to go back to one of the first things they start their chapter off, which is the idea of friendship. And the reason I want to go back to it now is because in some ways, this is something that anthropologists and others probably did not pay enough attention to. And so there's some great quotes in this section about how important friends are to people. And some people say that the importance of friendship is increasing in the modern world, and that the importance of kinship is decreasing. I'm not sure I want to necessarily say that, but I guess from my point of view, these relationships of friendship have been always tremendously important. The last time I taught this class, I assigned a long article that I didn't make you read this time, from an anthropologist who studied in the Kalahari in a hunting and gathering society. And she was talking about the importance of friendship among the people she was studying. And this is one of those societies that anthropologists classically would have just talked about, you know, the kin group and the band organization. And they wouldn't have talked about, you rarely think about hunting and gathering as a form of friendship among, or people wanting to associate with friends, and that would be important in these kinds of societies. And so, as Lavenda and Schultz say, friendship has in some ways been understudied in anthropology, in part because you can't make a chart about it, right? I mean, you can, and maybe we should, based on Facebook and social media, but it seems too fleeting, it seems too ephemeral. But that's not, in some ways, how we perceive and make friendship. And so, in many ways, our friends and the families we make, or what we talk about, the families we choose, can be as or more important than the idea of biological relatedness, which can be and is often extremely important, but many times not as important as these relationships of friendship. And that applies, I think, to our own society, but as well as to many others. So, big point of the class, at least this half of the chapter, is that we actively make our kinship and relatedness. We actively assign value to that, and we debate it and we think about it in our societies. It's a social process. And so there are some instances of people who others might consider to be our blood or our biological or genetic relations, that in other societies they don't pay any attention to. They do not prioritize, they are not selecting those as kin to them, they are not important as kin. But on the other hand, even those people who we consider to be blood or genetics or related biologically, there has to be more to it. It doesn't just happen. And so, you know, I mean, I think we all have our sayings about, you know, being a parent is not just giving birth. I mean, yes, that technically makes you a biological parent, but the real stuff of parenting and relatedness and those kinds of things is in the actions and the activities and those bonds that you make. And people can consider others to be their parents, aunts, cousins, tios, tias, primos, primas, who are not necessarily biologically related, but are important to them in this sense.